Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's presentation. My name is Dr. Noreen Leahy. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Pupil Personnel Services and Special Education in Rockville Center. But most importantly, I am a very proud member of the Rockville Center Drug, Alcohol, and Violence Prevention Task Force. We are very excited to announce that the work of the District Task Force has been energized by the formation of the Rockville Center Coalition for Youth. This coalition was formed in August of 2014, merging the mutual interests of the Rockville Center Youth Council, which has been around for about 8 years, providing environmental programming to prevent youth substance abuse, and the School District Task Force, which has been in place for decades, educating students and parents on the dangers of abuse. As you may have heard, this coalition, the Coalition for Youth, was the recent recipient of a $125,000 grant annually awarded for the next 5 years. And all I can say about that is watch out, because now we can put our money where our mouth is. Both the Youth Council and the District Task Force have a very long history of work against teen substance abuse, and both entities have worked with organizations throughout Rockville Center to spread that message. These organizations now represent the sectors of the Coalition for Youth, and along with the Youth Council and the District Task Force, they include School Board, Parent-Teacher Association, Police Department, the Village of Rockville Center, Students Against Destructive Decisions, Confide Counseling, the Chamber of Commerce, the Lions Club, Mercy Medical Center and South Nassau Hospital, Rockville Center Little League and other athletic organizations, the Hispanic Brotherhood, EOC, Martin Luther King, the Vineyard Church, and St. Agnes. We even have the Army on our side, as you saw when you walked in. In case any of the students in this audience missed that, let me break it down. That means that your classmates, your teachers, your administrators, your school board members, your parents, your mayor, his trustees, business leaders, medical providers, religious leaders, and community organizations care very deeply about you. We care very deeply that you are taking care of your mental, moral, and physical selves every minute of every day so you can live happy, successful, and purposeful lives. And that, my friends, is easier said than done. The temptations are many, but we stand ready to remind you with the activities and education campaigns that we plan regularly in our coalition meetings. We hope that you get our message every time you turn a corner in Rockville Center, when you order a pizza, when you go to the movies, when you drive your car down the street. Our message will be everywhere, and we hope it's loud and clear. Sadly, every so often, the community experiences a tragedy or a shocking event related to drug and alcohol abuse, and the interest is piqued. Interest and questions to us, to school, to police, asking us what we could have done to prevent the tragedy. But safe, structured, loving homes, schools with robust educational programs, community organizations which shape our students morally, mentally, and physically, and government and law enforcement which maintain order are the environmental factors that are going to keep you all safe. The Rockville Center Coalition for Youth promises to continue to offer you healthy alternatives, guidance and support in time of crisis, and a focused and energized team of community members who love our students and their families. This evening's presentation has been greatly anticipated. We are very thrilled this evening that Dr. Stephen Dewey has accepted the Coalition's invitation to speak to us about the effects of drugs of abuse on the teen brain. When you came in, you were given a short survey. We ask that you complete that survey before you leave this evening and just hand it to people at the doors that will be collecting them or in the boxes that will be out in the lobby. The grant that we received requires that we get feedback from the community on these presentations, so we appreciate your help. Dr. Dewey is the director and professor of the Laboratory for Behavioral and Molecular Neuroimaging at the Feinstein Institute for Medical Research in the North Shore LIJ Health Systems. He's a renowned neuroscientist who received his PhD from the University of Iowa. Dr. Dewey completed his postdoctoral fellowship in the neurology department at Stony Brook University. During his 24-year tenure at Brookhaven National Laboratory, Dr. Dewey conducted research on the effects of addictive drugs on the human brain. These studies led to the development of an effective treatment for addiction. In 2009, Dr. Dewey moved his research program to the Center for Neurosciences at the Feinstein Institute for Medical Research at North Shore LIJ. Dr. Dewey started an outreach program in 1994, bringing his research findings to school districts throughout Long Island and the tri-state area. His informative message has reached tens of thousands of school-age children, parents, teachers, administrators, and counselors. Recently, Dr. Dewey accepted an appointment to the Suffolk County Board of Health, where he continues his education efforts in the fight against drug abuse. Additionally, in 2015, he was appointed as the Director of Research Education at the Seafeld Center. Dr. Dewey's research has been featured on 2020, Dateline, Good Morning America, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, CNN, Fox News, News 12 Long Island, The New York Times, and Newsday. I thank you all very much for coming this evening. Please listen very carefully to Dr. Dewey's message. I want to especially thank the teachers and providers in our school district that are here this evening, your administrators, members of the school board, and mostly all of you, students and parents. And now it is my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Stephen Dewey.
Well, thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. I've got to say, I've been doing this for a really long time, and I don't know that I've ever seen an audience this big. So I think that speaks to your community, and I really appreciate you coming out. What I want to do is tell you a little bit about the research that I do every day. I'm not here to beat people up on drugs. I'm not here to make statements about drugs. I'm just here to show you what I see every day. And I'm kind of a laid-back individual, so if you have questions, I encourage you to ask. I'll be here as long as you want me to be here and answer as many questions as I can. So I grew up on Long Island. I went to school in New Jersey. I went to medical school in the Midwest, and I came back and did my residency postdoc at Stony Brook. I've always been interested in the effects of addictive drugs on the human brain, and that's what I have been studying for a really long time. I'm on my local school board and on the BOCES board, and I've always thought that the work that we do in substance abuse really needs to be disseminated to the community. I mean, we publish papers and we disseminate our science to the scientists in the world, but we really need to disseminate it to you guys. And we need to do it in such a way that you understand it. And that's really one of my goals, is to make it as simple for you as I can, and as clear so that you understand what it is we're seeing. And if you have questions about words I use or something I say, just ask me. Again, I've been doing it for a really long time, so there probably aren't many questions I haven't been asked. But I'll do my best to be simple and to kind of make it as interesting as I can. Sometimes science can be dry, but I'll do my best to make it interesting. And again, I really appreciate you coming out and listening. So I work at the Feinstein. For those of you who don't know where the Feinstein is, it's in Manhasset. I live on the east end of Long Island, so I live by expressway numbers. It's exit 33 on the Long Island Expressway. It's the research arm of what's now Northwell Health, and we study the effects of addictive drugs on the human brain, and I've been doing it for a really long time. We study the effects of addictive drugs in kids in elementary school, and believe it or not, we have a whole bunch of elementary school substance abusers, and kids in middle school and high school, and people in their 80s. So I think you all know that addiction crosses all ages. It's blind to age. And the number of substance abusers we're seeing has increased more in the last 5 years than in the 35 years I've been in the business. You probably saw this when it appeared in the New York Times in January. It's just the number of deaths from 2003 in the United States up to 2014. The number of deaths, people dying from opiate overdose, is now so large, it exceeds the number of kids that die from alcohol, the number of kids that die in car accidents, And this year, the number of kids that will die from handguns. We're now seeing so many kids losing their lives to opiates. We've never seen this number before. I've never seen it before. It's really kind of striking. So let's see if we can just get into some of the nuts and bolts. I think there isn't anyone in this room who isn't familiar with the more conventional imaging techniques that are out there, CT, X-ray, and MRI. These are imaging techniques that are in every hospital in the United States. But I think you all know that these are imaging techniques that take pictures of our body's anatomy, how our body looks. But if you think of a disease like addiction, or any disease for that matter, the common cold, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, diabetes, any disease you can think of represents a change in how your body lives, not how your body looks. Now, as diseases progress and the disease advances, then anatomy changes. So when the tumors get big enough, you can see them in your liver. And if you have multiple sclerosis, this is a young woman, her eyes are right here. Multiple sclerosis, when it starts to get advanced, leaves these white spots, we call them UBOs, unidentified bright objects. It's just consistent with the disease of MS. And of course, this is, right, a compound fracture of the bones in the forearm. So the point here is that we take pictures of the human body to understand what's going on. But if we really want to study diseases, any kind of disease, cancer, or in my case, addiction, we need a camera that takes pictures of how the body lives, not how the body looks. Right? As cancer progresses, it gets big enough to see. But imagine if you have a cancer cell or two. Cancer cells are living differently than all the cells around it. So we really need a camera that takes pictures of life, not anatomy. Well, I'm sure many of you know that camera is called a PET scanner. It stands for positron emission tomography. It's a camera that was developed at Brookhaven lab in 1960. But it didn't get really into any kind of real clinical utility until the last 5 or 6 years. But it's a camera that takes pictures of how the body lives, not how the body looks. PET scans are very simple to read. This is a PET scan of a normal human brain. Eyes are right up here. The way you read a PET scan is just by remembering colors of the rainbow, Roy G. Biv, where red means there's a whole lot going on in the brain, yellows and greens, less, blue and black, nothing. So PET scans are in color because we need to be able to look at a graded response. Are things living better than they did? Or is energy metabolism a little higher than it was? So PET scans are in color. You're not going to have any trouble reading them. And I will always tell you the eyes are up here unless they're not. Typical, classic PET scan. Here are 3 PET scans from 3 normal people. Now, the reason we talk about PET is because that's how we study the brains of individuals who've made a decision to use, in this case, we're going to talk about substance abuse, but you have to think about addiction as a much broader disease. There are people addicted to behaviors, gambling. Obesity is addiction to food. So we look at those things as well, but tonight we'll focus on substance abuse. So 3 PET scans, 3 normal people. Yet the scans are very, very different. On your left is a PET scan from a 5-day-old baby. Now, I have 2 kids. When my kids were 5 days old, they didn't do much. 5-day-old kids don't do much. They can nurse, eat, and they can see the difference between light and dark, but not much more. And the reason they can't is because their brains aren't very, very active. They don't have the myelin that they need. The cells are still dividing. Things aren't really connected right. Not right, but things aren't fully connected. So their brains aren't terribly active. In the middle is a 6-year-old boy. Now, when my son was 6, like every 6-year-old, they're getting into everything, right? 6-year-olds are frustrating, right? They get into things, they beat up their sister, they pull the dog's tail, they do all kinds of things. So their brains are very, very active. This is someone in their mid-30s. As we get older, our brain becomes less active. That's just the way it is. It's perfectly normal. It's what should happen. But the point is that as we age, our brain becomes less active. Now, if I showed you a CAT scan or an MRI of these three people, you couldn't tell them apart. But if you look at how their brain lives, it's very easy to tell them apart. So I really tell you this for two reasons. One, it kind of shows you the extent or the sensitivity of PET. We can see basically nothing, or we can see a whole lot. But two, and perhaps more importantly, it says something that's really important to us in the field of science, and that is that age matters. Age really matters. If I'm going to show you a 12-year-old methamphetamine abuser, and I have many, then I have to compare that to a 12-year-old who isn't. I can't compare a 12-year-old to a 15-year-old. I can't compare a 6-year-old to a 35-year-old because age matters. So, when we study people who abuse drugs, we have to have normal controls with them. That means for every 15-year-old kid who's using meth, I've got to scan a 15-year-old kid who isn't. So, every scan that you'll see tonight has an age-matched control with it. So we're comparing apples to apples. Okay, so you'll see a 12-year-old meth abuser. I'll compare her to a 12-year-old who isn't. We have fourth grade alcoholics that we compare to fourth graders who aren't. So, if you've never seen a PET scanner, here it is. It's not a terribly impressive instrument. It's just a big box with a hole in the center. This happens to be a whole body camera. That means we can scan head to toe. Some PET scanners are just head only. Ours are whole body because we use them for oncology as well. So people who have cancer throughout their body, we scan them with a PET. Okay, so we now need to get on a common page about what drug abuse is and what it isn't. All of us in this room and everyone on the planet has a chemical in their brain called dopamine. We all have it. Everyone's got it. Everyone who's on planet Earth has it. It's a neurotransmitter, a chemical in our brain that we use to do something that's really important, primarily our ability to move. The fact that you all walked in here, the fact that you're all sitting upright, means that you have a dopamine system that's working. Whenever you want to move a finger, an arm, a leg, whenever you want to move, your brain releases dopamine to let that happen. So dopamine is the chemical in your brain that allows you to move. It's pretty simple. When you lose dopamine, you have trouble moving. That's a disease called Parkinson's. Parkinson's disease, Michael J. Fox. Parkinson's disease is a loss of brain dopamine. So when you start to lose dopamine, and you need to lose more than 90% of it before you become symptomatic, you get movement disorders. So dopamine, a chemical in your brain that underlies your ability to move. Next, every single addictive drug in the world, doesn't matter what it is, from caffeine to methamphetamine, heroin, ecstasy, cigarettes, alcohol, whatever the addictive drug is, acid, LSD, peyote, spice, whatever the addictive drug is, they all work the same way. Every addictive drug works by elevating brain dopamine. It's really simple. That's how addictive drugs work. You take an addictive drug, dopamine levels go up. Smoke a cigarette, dopamine levels go up. Take a shot of alcohol, dopamine levels go up. So, dopamine allows you to move. Dopamine is also the chemical in your brain that allows you to feel pleasure. So let's give you some perspective. It's, what is it, Wednesday night? It's Wednesday night. Oh, kidding me. Something that makes you happy. Oh, so let's say last night you're a supporter of Donald Trump and he won all those things. And you're really happy that he won all those things. If you're happy from a natural reward, Donald Trump wins, your favorite football team wins, you're with your kids, you're with your spouse, it's Friday afternoon. Anything that makes you happy, a natural reward that makes you happy, increases your dopamine levels by about 5%. So if you're happy because your favorite sports team won, 5% increase. If you're happy because it's Friday, 5% increase. If you're sad that it's Monday morning, 5 or 6% decrease. If your favorite football team loses, 5 or 6% decrease. So it's pretty simple. Dopamine is the chemical that allows you to feel happy or sad. Now, when you take a drug like methamphetamine, methamphetamine is ubiquitous. It's all over Long Island. It's all over the Northeast. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but it's here. It's in every school district. You're happy because you're with your family, 5% increase. You use methamphetamine, 900,000% increase. 900,000. 5% if you're happy because it's Friday afternoon. 900,000 if you use meth. So this is what we're up against. Anything you can think of that makes you happy is going to raise your dopamine levels 5%, maybe 6%. But a drug like meth, 900,000. So this is what we're up against. Every single addictive drug out there works by increasing brain dopamine. And the degree to which it does that tells us how addictive the drug is. So methamphetamine, 900,000, the most addictive drug we've ever seen. Alcohol, dose dependently, 1,000 to 2,000. Pot, dose dependently, 2,000 to 5,000, right? So you kind of get a sense that every addictive drug increases dopamine, but it does it to a different extent. And the extent to which it does it tells us how addictive the drug is. Next, we've been very interested in this component of substance abuse. We know that not everyone on planet Earth abuses drugs. We know that. The question is, how come some kids do and some kids don't? Well, it turns out over the years, the past decades, we have gone into audiences this size, smaller and bigger, and asked the question, how many of you will do anything once? And hands will go up. And how many of you won't do anything once? And hands will go up. So we kind of have two groups. We have a group of people who say, I'll do anything once, and we're going to call them novelty seeking. And we have kids who won't. Now we go and we look at their brain, and what do we see is very interesting, very reproducible. That is, kids who on self-report, kids who say to us, we'll do anything once, their dopamine level is about 5% higher than the kid who won't. Let's take a look. This is a PET scan looking at brain dopamine. We can have our PET scanner look at and measure brain dopamine. Very simple, very reproducible, very quantitative. On your left is a normal control. A kid who said, nope, I'm not going to do anything once. I'm not interested in novel things. Normal control. On the right is a kid who said, you know what, I'll try anything once. And believe me, there are a lot of kids that say, I'll try anything once. And what we see is pretty simple. The guy on the right has more brain dopamine than the guy on the left. This is direct evidence that speaks to the question of whether or not addiction is truly a disease. Now, you might imagine, I've been in this business so long, I hear all the time, it's not a disease. Fair enough. But if we start to look at the human brain, what we see is there are changes in brain dopamine in people before they ever try their first drug. So the brain changed before the kid went out and did a beer bong. The brain changed before the kid went and did a keg stand. So we have really good evidence, really reproducible evidence, that the reason that some kids choose to use a drug and some kids don't is because some kids have dopamine levels that are a little bit higher. And that little bit higher seems to underlie compulsive behavior, that is, the willingness to try something new. So, novelty seeking appears to be, reproducibly, a difference between dopamine in those who say they'll do something novel and those who don't. Your sense of well-being, are you happy or are you sad? We typically think of mood as serotonin. Serotonin is like dopamine. It's another chemical in your brain. It plays an important role in regulating body temperature, but it also plays a role in your mood. If you have low serotonin levels, you're typically depressed. And we treat depression by giving drugs called SSRIs, serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors, Prozac, citalopram, drugs that elevate serotonin. Now, if you elevate serotonin, you very effectively address depression. Well, we could also give drugs that increase brain dopamine to treat depression. We don't, because drugs that increase brain dopamine tend to be addictive. So we tend to stay away from drugs that elevate dopamine to treat depression. And of course, addiction. Every single drug of abuse works by increasing brain dopamine. So we now have really good data that shows us that dopamine plays an important role in motivating, for lack of a better word, kids to try something novel. The next question is, why do they do it twice? Once they do it once, it's no longer novel, right? Once you go and do a keg stand, it's no longer novel because you've done it. So the next question is, why do people do it twice? Well, turns out that the number one answer is because of the environment. Well, that's not obvious. It certainly wasn't obvious when we published it many years ago. The number one reason that people do drugs more than once or do them repetitively is because of the environment. Well, that's not terribly obvious, and it certainly isn't easy to explain. So what we did was I went and looked at, this is the most commonly abused drug in the world today, caffeine. Number 2 is alcohol, but it's not even in the same ballpark. What I did was I went out and I got 40 people, and I brought them to my imaging center. Now, they were all going to be controls. Right? I told you I need to have controls for every age that I scan. I need to have 18-year-olds who don't do anything to compare to the 18-year-olds who do. So I brought 40 people into my imaging center. The youngest was 18, the oldest in their 60s. Drug-free, no history of substance abuse. They were going to be controls. They came to my imaging center. A PET scan takes about 8 minutes, 10 minutes depending on what we're doing. Brought them to my imaging center and I scanned them. Now, the only requirement was they had to like coffee. That was it. No history of substance abuse. Come to my imaging center. You're going to be a normal control. If you like coffee, you have to like coffee. Okay. So while I'm scanning them, remember, they didn't have any drug, nothing. I didn't give them a thing. I brewed a pot of coffee in the next room. So my experimental condition is pretty simple. I've got people in my PET scanner who like coffee, having a PET scan, and now I'm going to cue them to the coffee they like by letting them smell coffee. They can't have it, they can't taste it, they can't see it, they didn't know it was coming, but all of a sudden they could smell it. So now I'm cueing them to a drug they like. And this is what we see. These are all 40 brains added up. This is a sagittal view of the human brain. So you're looking at the brain like this. Coronal, all 40 are looking at you. Transaxial, eyes are here, feet are into the board. And what do we see? In the absence of any drug, they got nothing. But in the presence of a cue for a drug they like, 2 spots in their brain turn on. You only see 1 spot here because in this is only half the brain. 2 spots, 2 spots. Remember the 6-year-old, his brain was active everywhere. Here you have a very discrete, very focal response. In the absence of the drug, but in the presence of a cue for a drug they like, the nucleus accumbens, part of the brain, turns on. Now the nucleus accumbens is something in the brain that every one of us in this room uses every day. It's the part of the brain that motivates you to get something you need. You use it whenever you're thirsty. If you're thirsty, your accumbens turns on and tells you to get water. If you're hungry, it turns on and tells you to get food. If you're in a place that's not safe, it turns on and tells you to find safety. The point here is that in the absence of a drug, but in the presence of a cue for a drug they like, the part of the brain that makes them get it turns on. Now, this happens to be one of the oldest parts of your brain. Oldest meaning phylogenetically. Frogs have a huge nucleus accumbens because that's what they live on. It shows you that whenever you use a drug that changes the way you feel, everything about the environment you're in when you use it, when re-exposed to it, causes you to go seek it. So, the kid who's smoking pot with his friend, and 4 days later sees his friend, his accumbens turns on. What I hear every day, the most common thing I hear from kids is music. I can't tell you how many times I hear, if I listen to, I don't know, what did I hear the other, Justin Bieber. If I listen to Justin Bieber, I'm going to jump out a window. But if some kids listen to Justin Bieber, their brain turns on and motivates them to seek the drug. The thing to remember here is really, really simple. Whenever you use a drug that alters the way you feel, everything about the environment you're in when you use it gets stored in your brain with it. And every time you get re-exposed to any part of that environment, your accumbens activates. So the reason people are doing the drug more than once is because their brain is cueing them to go get it. It's something to keep in mind. If you look at treatment, how do we treat? What's the number one thing we try to do with treatment? Get people out of the environment they're in. Get them away from the friends they're doing things with. Get them away from the car that they're using in. Get them away from the beach that they go to when they use. Because anytime you re-experience the environment where you used, your accumbens turns on. And your accumbens is an incredibly powerful motivator. The way to think of it is, the next time you're thirsty, don't get a drink. And then the next time you're thirsty, just don't get a drink for the next couple days. And you'll see how hard it is to come up against an accumbens that is turned on and activated, telling you to do something that it needs. Let's take a look at what caffeine does to the human brain. On the right is a normal PET scan, 15-year-old kid. Bring him in, get a normal PET scan on a Monday morning. Then I give him one 16-ounce can of Monster. Does everyone know what Monster is? If you don't, ask your kids. It's the green, 3 green lines. It's an energy drink. I give him one can of Monster. He's got 30 minutes to drink it. And here's his brain. So you can see as well as I can what caffeine does to the human brain. The way to think of it is, everyone know what a dimmer switch is? When you drink caffeine, you take that dimmer switch and jack it all the way up, and your brain becomes incredibly active. Well, we kind of didn't need to do PET scans to know this, because that's why we drink coffee in the morning, because it kind of gets us going. The surprise here, of course, is the magnitude of the effect. This is okay if you're 6, but not so good when you're 15. Nothing gets the 15-year-old brain this activated but caffeine. But it shows you what happens. When you use caffeine, which is an addictive substance, it causes your brain to become metabolically hyper-metabolic. So your brain metabolism goes way up. Again, not terribly impressive, certainly predictable. But what wasn't predictable was this. I had him come in on a Monday morning. I did the scan, gave him his stuff, drank it, took a picture. I then brought him back Tuesday morning, and I scanned him again. And his brain looks just like this. So here we have the second tenet of substance abuse, and that is, whenever you use a drug that alters the way you feel, it changes your brain for a lot longer than it changes the way you feel. So, he comes back Tuesday morning, he's half asleep. You know, he hasn't had anything to drink, the kid's half asleep. And I put him in the scanner, and there's his brain. So, the caffeine effect takes 24 to 36 hours to return to normal. You have one dose of caffeine, and you'll change your brain for 24 to 36 hours. Yet, you'll change the way you feel for only minutes or maybe hours. I drink coffee in the morning, 6:30 in the morning. By 10 o'clock, I'm ready for a nap. But my brain is going to be active like this. So it just shows you that drugs change the brain for a lot longer than they change how you feel. And that's really important, because what you hear all the time is kids will polyabuse. They'll smoke pot, they'll get high, they'll crash, they're not high anymore, they'll smoke again to get high, but their brain is still changed. So now you're causing this potentiated effect because of the absence of the perception. That just means that kids will smoke pot or kids will drink alcohol, feel the effect will go away, they'll use again, but their brain is still changed. So you can now start to see how continued use produces potentiated damage, because the kids no longer feel the effect. They say, well, I'm no longer drunk, so my brain's back to normal. They drink again, but their brain has changed. So this effect is 24 to 36 hours. Nicotine and smoking. If you ask kids why they smoke, they'll give you 10,000 reasons. And you say, well, what do you hear about smoking? And they'll say cancer. And you give them the statistics. The statistics are really simple. Only about 7% of people who smoke cigarettes get cancer. 93% don't. And they'll tell you, my parents don't have cancer, my grandparents don't have cancer, they've been smoking for 20. So the risk, and the kids know this, the risk of getting cancer from smoking is very low. Now the risk of getting cardiovascular disease, all kinds of other things, renal failure, over 80%. But they'll focus on the cancer risk because they know the cancer risk is low. Let's take a look at what smoking does to the human brain. On the left is a 22-year-old female, non-smoker. Her eyes are right up here. This time in the PET scan, we're looking at a very specific chemical called monoamine oxidase, and I'll tell you what it does in a minute. We all have it. Everyone on planet Earth has it. It's in the center of our brain in a structure called the thalamus. It's up here in the striatum. It's up here in the anterior cingulate, and pretty much evenly distributed throughout the rest of the brain. It's called monoamine oxidase. We all have it, unless you smoke. If you smoke, this is a 22-year-old female smoker. You can see as well as I can that almost all of her MAO is gone. Now, just to remind you, if I showed you an MRI of these two, there's no change in anatomy. They look perfectly the same. A CAT scan, perfectly the same. An X-ray, perfectly the same. It's not until you look at how the brain is living that you start to pick up the chemical differences. So here's the deal with smoking. If you smoke cigarettes, hookah, chew tobacco, smoke a pipe, smoke cigars, if you do that, you will destroy almost all of the monoamine oxidase in your brain. Not half of you, not 3/4 of you, every one, period. If you smoke, you will destroy monoamine oxidase, period. If you are exposed to secondhand smoke, you'll lose it too. So there isn't anyone in this planet, no one here, who hasn't been exposed to secondhand smoke. So there isn't anyone here who hasn't lost some monoamine oxidase. Now the question is, what does it do? That's pretty simple. Let's go back to the dopamine story. I told you that if you're happy because your favorite sports team won, your dopamine levels will go up 5%. Well, so if your favorite sports team wins, dopamine goes up 5% and you're thrilled, you're not thrilled the rest of your life. You might not even be thrilled the rest of the day. You're happy. Well, people are happy and then they're not happy. The reason that you can be happy and not happy within a short period of time is because if your brain releases dopamine to allow you to walk, if your brain releases dopamine to allow you to feel happy, it has to have a way to get rid of it. If it didn't get rid of it, you couldn't stop moving, and if it didn't get rid of it, we'd all be high the rest of our lives. This is the chemical that gets rid of dopamine. Monoamine oxidase is what breaks down dopamine. Your brain releases it, MAO gets rid of it. Real simple. Now, I'm always asked, what's the silver lining here? Well, there is a silver lining, and that is, this is the only effect I have tonight to show you that's reversible. That means if you quit smoking, it comes back. If you smoke for a week and quit, it comes back. If you smoke for 30 years and quit, it comes back. It takes about 55 days and it comes back. So, For everyone in here who's breathing secondhand smoke, when you get away from the smoke, about 55 days later, your MAO's back. But what does it mean in the real world? So, remember we had those two populations. We have the kids who say they'll do anything once, and the kids who say they won't. And what separates those two is a brain dopamine system such that the kids who are novelty seeking have about 5% more dopamine than the kids who don't. Now let's take all those kids who said they won't, and we send them to a party. And at that party, people are smoking cigarettes. And those kids are breathing in secondhand smoke. In about 30 minutes, they start to lose monoamine oxidase. In about an hour, their dopamine levels start to go up. In about 90 minutes, their dopamine level is about 5% higher than when they walked in. What does that mean? I now have all those kids who said they wouldn't do anything in a room where people are smoking and their dopamine level is the same level as the kids who said they will. I can't tell you how many kids I see every week who say, I don't know why the hell I did it. I don't know why I did a keg stand. I don't know why I tried ecstasy. What we now know is the presence of secondhand smoke will change monoamine oxidase, causing it to go away. When monoamine oxidase goes away, the dopamine system is no longer in check, dopamine levels start to rise. And in not such a long period of time, they're about 5% higher. That's all it took to separate those kids who said they won't from the kids who said they will. So the thing here is to just be aware that in the presence of secondhand smoke, your brain chemistry is changing. Those changes can produce increases in dopamine. Increases in dopamine can underlie your willingness to try something you might not. It's just something to keep in mind. Kids will now, the first thing kids will say is they're going to e-cigarettes. Now, I think everyone here knows the e-cigarette is no different in its design than methadone was for heroin addicts. That is, the theory behind the e-cigarette is we're going to deliver nicotine to treat the addiction part of the disease, but we're going to give it to you in a safe way. And that's exactly what it does. E-cigarettes circumvent or get rid of the monoamine oxidase effect because it's not nicotine in tobacco that's doing it. It's a couple of other compounds that are in the tobacco leaf. So if you use an e-cigarette with nicotine, liquid nicotine, then you don't have the issue of a monoamine oxidase loss. The problem with e-cigarettes are well known in that nicotine likes to exist as a solid. To make nicotine a liquid for these devices, you got to do some fancy chemistry. And one of the things that you need to do is you need to add a little bit of formaldehyde. So I think you've all seen now formaldehyde is in the news because of that flooring, lumber liquidate. I don't know, someone's making flooring that's got formaldehyde in it. Formaldehyde is the chemical that we use to embalm bodies. Well, they put a little formaldehyde in the nicotine solution to get it into solution so it can be used in e-cigarettes. So kids who are using e-cigarettes for nicotine, not kids who are vaping THC oil, not kids who are using e-cigarettes for pot, nicotine. They're getting a little bit of formaldehyde. Alcohol. So the alcohol story is an old one. We have a really good understanding of what's going on in the disease of alcoholism. I don't think there's anyone in this room who isn't familiar with the ways that people are abusing alcohol. The classic beer funnel, shotgun, keg stand, beer pong. When I was in medical school, the game to be played was called quarters. Now it's beer pong. Everyone knows what beer pong is. In the last 6 years, we have seen an enormous increase in using alcohol this way. In fact, it is now the #1 drinking game in colleges where they're putting alcohol in their eyes. It's called eyeballing. It's very, very common. What kids are doing is they're taking typically clear alcohol, so gin and vodka, and they're taking the top off the bottle, and then they put their eye on the bottle and tip the bottle back. Now, our eyes are nothing more than spheres full of water. Now, if there are any chemists in this room, you know that alcohol and water mix. They like to be where the other one is. So when you tip your eye back, all the water in your eye, it's called aqueous humor, goes away and it gets filled with alcohol. And kids are getting hammered. We see it all the time. It's become very, very common. You might ask the obvious question, which is why? And the answer is just as obvious. If you go to a party and you're drinking at that party and you leave that party and the cop pulls you over and he gives you a breathalyzer, if you haven't had alcohol in your mouth, it doesn't come up in the breathalyzer. So the reason they're doing it, the reason they're putting it in their eyes, is because it circumvents them getting caught. Now, this is, I have 2 kids. When they were in high school, Dad would always stay up. Kids would come home from the party. Have you been drinking? Absolutely not. Come over here and breathe on me. They breathe on you, right, busted. But if you never put it in your mouth, it doesn't come out in your breath. So that's why they're doing it. Now, you might ask, or you might say, doesn't it hurt? It hurts a lot. Unfortunately, you think that's a deterrent, but it's not. I now get kids in my ER who come in unconscious, and in their pocket is a little piece of paper, and on that piece of paper, it says, Michael, 6 minutes, 10 seconds. David, 5 minutes, 4 seconds. Nancy, 3 minutes. They time themselves. They make it a game. Who can keep the bottle up the longest? It's become incredibly common in fraternities and sororities. You know, not so long ago were the days where they would put kids in the trunk of a car with 2 bottles of Jack Daniels and say, when they're gone, we'll open the lid. Well, that caused obvious issues. So now what they do is they see how long you can keep the bottle up to your eye, and you have to keep it up for a certain amount of time to get to the next step of pledging. It's really common. We see it. The problem, though, is the obvious one. In the last 7 years, we've seen an estimated increase of over 1,000% of self-report of people eyeballing. That means kids admitting to it in college campuses. College campuses are really good, for the most part, at getting at these data. They're trying to understand who's doing it, how many people are doing, and we get that data to look at trends. So this enormous increase in eyeballing, the problem with those data are their self-report, which means they're usually underestimated. Kids usually don't confess to it, so the number is low. But what isn't low is the number of cases of blindness that we're seeing. So we're seeing about a 210, 215% increase in blindness. Because if you put alcohol in your retina, in your eye, it fixes the retina and people lose their sight. The 2 most recent papers that came out back in the fall suggest that the time from the last time you put it in your eye to the first time you become symptomatic of a visual loss can be 6 to 9 months. So what does that mean? That means the kid goes and tries it Friday or Saturday night. What the hell, I'm going to try it, tries it. Next day says, well, I'm not doing that again. 6 to 9 months from that point, they can start to lose their vision. So it's a really risky thing to do. And I always say, if you get nothing from me tonight, you leave here and you don't remember a damn thing. You don't want to put alcohol in your eyes. That's what you don't want to do. More common than eyeballing is something called tamping, where people are soaking tampons in alcohol and using them. Now, the obvious comment is, girls are crazy. But here's the thing. 3/4 of my cases are boys. It's more common in men than it is in women. And it's really, really common. What they're doing is they're typically soaking tampons in alcohol and using them. I can't tell you how common it is. We see it almost every week. Now, alcohol is an incredibly powerful drying agent. If you've ever been to the doctor and we put that little alcohol pad on you and it feels cold, that's because it's drying your skin. So alcohol is very good at drying things out. In women who use tampons with alcohol, sterility can happen after a single dose. In men who use tampons with alcohol, they dry out their colon. When your colon gets dried out, it tears. When you tear your colon, you can become septic. Sepsis is the #1 killer in hospitals today. So it's a really, really risky thing to do, yet it's unbelievably common. Because kids can now sit in class drunk. They don't smell of alcohol, it's not on their breath, and there certainly isn't any way to test for it. But we see it. It's something to be aware of. It's common. We started seeing it about 7 years ago. Now, school districts all around us report kids who have been caught tamping or eyeballing. The eyeballing is a pretty simple thing to catch. Once you put alcohol in your eye, it becomes very bloodshot. It becomes kind of hard to see out of that eye. So it's uncommon that they'll do both eyes. So when a kid shows up with one bloodshot eye, the whole thing about there being smoke at the party doesn't kind of sell. So that's a way to look for it. Let's take a look at the consequences. So here's a 21-year-old male. His eyes are right up here. Normal PET scan. This is around at the level of the eyes. This is around at the level of the ears. When I say level, it just means what plane. This is this plane about the level of my eyes. This plane about the level of my ears. Normal PET scan. Now we get that individual intoxicated. And here's his PET scan. You can see as well as I can that the brain, remember with caffeine we took that dimmer switch and we pushed it up. With alcohol we take that dimmer switch and we slide it down. The brain becomes profoundly hypometabolic. All that means is the neurons are not firing like they should. This part of the brain actually shuts off here. This is something called your cerebellum. Cerebellum's primary role is balance. If you've ever seen anyone drunk, they don't balance as well because their cerebellum's off. So pretty straightforward, pretty simple effect, very predictable. We know that when you're intoxicated, your brain metabolism goes way down. You slide the dimmer switch. What we didn't know was the time course. This takes 5 to 7 days to recover. What does that mean? That means if you drink on a Saturday night and you think you're going to go to school with a normal brain on Monday, not even close. Your brain doesn't return to normal till Thursday. So your brain is hypometabolic for 5 to 7 days after you get intoxicated. This is a dose-dependent effect. The more you drink, the greater the decrease. So what are kids doing? They're starting out with a normal metabolism and they drink and it drops. And 5 to 7 days later it returns. They drink and it drops. 5 to 7 days, right? And they continue to play that game until at some point that game ends. On your left is a 52-year-old male, eyes are right up here, normal PET scan. In the middle is a 51-year-old male, alcoholic, who hasn't had a drink in over 20 years. He is permanently hypometabolic. That means that at some point in the process, the brain sees this hypometabolic state as so common that it now adapts the hypometabolic state. And there's no way to get it back to where it was except if you continue drinking. This is a 52-year-old male alcoholic who's drunk when I took the picture, and his PET scan is normal. If you ever ask alcoholics why they drink, the #1 answer is they drink to feel normal. They don't drink to get drunk, they drink to feel normal. In fact, the alcoholic is self-medicating for the very disease alcohol induced. That's why it's so hard to treat it. When you're alcoholic and alcohol-free, you're profoundly hypometabolic. To get your brain back up to this, we don't know of another way. Alcohol, though, in the alcoholic seems to do it. So it's something to keep in mind. The alcoholic isn't drinking to get drunk, he's drinking to feel normal. And that's exactly what the PET scans show us. Now you might imagine, and I'm not maligning Texas, I don't mean to malign Texas, but the state of Texas has taken these data and they're now trying to legislate that alcoholics should be allowed to drive drunk because their brains are normal. I'm not maligning Texas, but it's out there. You can see it you can Google it and see it. But so people are taking these data to try to legislate allowing alcoholics to drink. But it's something to keep in mind that the disease of alcoholism is one whereby after successive times, the metabolic response to the brain adapts the hypometabolic state. Now the question I usually get asked is how much? How much does it take? Well, we don't know, because I can't take someone who isn't, make them drink, and see when this occurs. I can't do that, obviously. But I know that there are a couple of things that make this happen sooner. Because everything we do here, we have to do in animals before we can go into people. It's just the way it is. The FDA won't let me do anything that I haven't done in animals first. So I can tell you there are two great predictors of this. One is the earlier you drink. So my fourth graders who are drinking, this is going to happen sooner than the seniors I have. So the earlier you start to drink, the sooner this happens. Next, the pattern. We talk about a glass of wine a night for 7 nights is 7 glasses of wine in a week. But if you have 7 glasses of wine Saturday night, it's still 7 glasses of wine in a week, but you're binge drinking. Binge drinking makes this happen sooner. And that's what we see in colleges. In college campuses, kids binge drink. Now I'm sure you all know the big drinking night is Thursday. When I was in college, it wasn't Thursday, it was the weekend. When I was in medical school, it was the weekend. Now it's Thursday. I don't know why it's Thursday. Thursday's a big drinking night. Binge drinking brings this on much sooner. So it kind of gives you a sense of the extent of the disease of alcoholism. The brain actually chooses to adopt this low metabolic state. Now, the consequence of a low metabolic state is that when your brain is hypometabolic, when your brain is like this, other drugs become more addictive faster. So the kid who's drinking and smoking pot is going to run into addiction to pot or alcohol much sooner. The kid who's drinking and using cocaine is going to get hooked to cocaine much sooner. Because when your brain is metabolically blunted, it doesn't have the energy that it needs to fight off the delivery of the drugs. One of the things that's always interested me is this family history thing. We know that alcoholism has a genetic component to it. That is, if we look across the United States and look at epidemiology data, what we find is about 1/3 of alcoholics have a first-degree relative with an alcohol issue. So we went and looked at kids born of alcoholic parents. Now these were kids whose parent, mom or dad, was an alcoholic prior to their conception, right? So that means if we're going to study Bill's dad didn't become an alcoholic yesterday. Bill's dad was an alcoholic before Bill was conceived. And what we find, you're looking at brain dopamine. Here's brain dopamine, normal, no family history. Here's a 22-year-old kid, no family history, hypodopaminergic. In the case of alcoholism, hypodopaminergic predicts the disease. So here we have a biochemical measure showing that in about 1/3 of kids born of a single alcoholic parent, they have a dopamine system that's primed for alcoholism. Now, it doesn't mean that if your mom or dad was an alcoholic and you're one of these 1/3, you're going to be one. Doesn't mean that at all. All it means is if your mom or dad was an alcoholic and you are hypodopaminergic, you're going to have a response to alcohol that's different than someone who isn't. You may or may not ever become an alcoholic. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. It just says that we need to counsel kids who have alcoholism as a parent, not grandparent, your mom or dad, and tell them that, if you drink alcohol, you have a chance of having a different response to it than your friend who doesn't have a parent that's that way. So it's something to keep in mind. We now have really good data that shows what we've now seen epidemiologically. That is, that about 1/3 of alcoholics have a first-line parent with alcoholism. Pot, let's just cut to the chase with pot. So forever I was told, I've been in the business 35 years. For 35 years I've heard pot doesn't do anything to the brain. And the reason we don't have really good data with pot was because it's really hard to find people who just abuse pot. So I can't have if I want to look at the effects of pot, I can't have someone who smokes pot and drinks alcohol, because now I've got two variables. Then came along the state of Colorado. And in the state of Colorado, people went to the imaging center and said, I've never smoked pot in my life, but I'm starting tomorrow. And they did PET scans on them, and then they started smoking pot, and they followed them. This came out in October of 2014. These data show in 500 adolescent kids, so 12 to 19, marijuana has a profound effect on just the front part of the brain. Just the front part, just the front, here, the eyes. It has a profound effect on the front part of the brain. Not everywhere else, just the front. Front part of our brain is called your frontal lobes. It's the part of the brain that develops last. In women, it develops by the age of 22 or 23. Men, 23 or 24. Now here's an interesting statistic. If you can avoid using an addictive drug until your frontal lobes develop, so that's 22, 23, if you can avoid using an addictive drug until you're 23, the probability that you're going to get addicted to anything in the rest of your life is less than 1%. Less than 1%. Addiction is a disease that occurs during adolescence. And the reason is because during adolescence, your frontal lobes aren't developed. So your dopamine levels have a normal rhythm. When you get to be 23, 24, your dopamine levels kind of steady out. And it's much more difficult to change them. Now, if you smoke pot during adolescence, you arrest the development of your frontal lobe. That is, you stop it. So pot stops the frontal lobes from developing. Why is it specific to the frontal lobe? Because it's the only part of the brain that's developing when they're using. So the way to think of it is this. If you start smoking pot when you're 15, and you smoke it until you're 25, and then you quit, you get a job, whatever happens, you've got to stop smoking pot because you're going to get drug tested. At 25, your frontal lobe is like it was 15. You've arrested the development of your frontal lobe. Now, what does your frontal lobe do? It's what separates adolescents from adults. This is where I pick on my kids. When my kids were in high school, no offense, they'd do the strangest things. You'd sit there and go, why the hell did you do that? Because adolescents don't have a frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is what allows you to take data points and make a decision based on some kind of projected future. Well, 15-year-olds don't think the future for a 15-year-old is 20 minutes from now. It's not 10 years. So when you start smoking pot during adolescence, you arrest the ability to make adult decisions. So what does it mean? It means they'll do things that we kind of just don't get. And as they continue to smoke, they've arrested the development of their frontal lobe. That has a profound effect on decisions they will later make. So what's so scary about it is it's so unique to that part of the brain. It's just unique to the front, which is the part that's developing. Spice. I think you've all heard spice is pretty common now. Most people who are using spice are people who have been incarcerated or arrested, and they need to pass urine tests. And if they show up positive for pot, they get thrown back in jail. So they came up with this synthetic pot. Synthetic pot is spice. It's very common. Used to be able to get it at 7-Elevens and convenience stores. I think now you can't. But to tell you what it is, it really is stuff out of your lawnmower bag. It isn't marijuana plants at all. It's really kind of grass clippings. And what they did is they added a bunch of chemicals to it that produce cannabinoid-like effects, but the way that people get high on it is by depriving the brain of oxygen. Now, if you don't know, one of the ways people can get high is by autoerotic asphyxiation. They strangle themselves. If you cut the blood supply off to your brain, dopamine is released and people become euphoric. So spice took advantage of that and cuts the oxygen saturation in your blood, depriving your brain of oxygen. And that's why kids are getting high on spice. Now, you can do a lot of things to your brain. You can be a boxer, you can play in the NFL, you can use every drug known to mankind, and the brain's pretty resilient. What it's not good at is suffering oxygen deprivation. So when you use spice, it starts to affect the brain really quickly because it causes neuronal cell death. Normal brain, individual who's been abusing spice. Most change in the frontal lobes, changes here in the parietal lobe, all brought on by a lack of oxygen. Ecstasy. You probably saw last year, a year and a half ago, across the sound, 14 kids, Stamford, Connecticut. Ecstasy, NMDA, Molly. Madonna sings a song about Molly. This is a very common drug. It was actually, and a reason I say this is because kids say it to me all the time. We used to write prescriptions for it in the early 70s, and it's true, they did. Back in the early 70s, there was this thinking that couples who were having marital trouble would do better if you gave them some ecstasy and they could open up about their feelings. Right, so that went away, and now kids are abusing it. The thing with ecstasy is very simple. This is the one pill that's out there that is contains the least amount of the active chemical. So a typical ecstasy pill has about 5% of NMDA in it. 95% of the rest of it's junk. Because if it had 10%, it would kill you. So very low dose, but because it's low dose, it means they can put other stuff in it. Ecstasy kills serotonin cells, raises dopamine, but it kills serotonin cells. And what kids will say to me is this the thing that pokes holes in your brain? And if that came from post-mortem studies of kids who used ecstasy that died, where they went and cut their brain, looked at sections, and the part of your brain that has serotonin cells is called the raphe nucleus, and those cells die and you get these big holes. So it's true that ecstasy is the one that produces holes in your brain because it kills serotonin cells. The number one cause of suicide in high schools is an ecstasy-induced depression. When you get a regular depression, idiosyncratic depression, just develops, we treat you with an SSRI. But if you get depression because you've used ecstasy, the treatments don't work because you've killed the cells we're trying to fix. So ecstasy kills serotonin cells. Serotonin, besides mood, I also said regulates body temperature. Now, when my kids were little and their temperatures would go up to 101, 102, my wife and I would panic, throw the kid in an ice cold bath and wig out. But in ecstasy, it'll bring your temperature up to about 107, which is fatal. So if you've ever seen kids who are using ecstasy, they're drinking all the time. The other thing they're using is Vicks. You know Vicks? Vicks is that vapor rub because it helps cool the body down. So if you ever go to a party, just as a hint, and you smell Vicks, think about it. This is what ecstasy does. This is a normal human brain. We're looking at serotonin. Here's our ecstasy user. Starts to kill serotonin. Here's actual brain tissue. Normal 18-year-old kid, normal serotonin. Here's a kid who committed suicide. All his serotonin is gone. This is a kid who's using LSD. LSD kills serotonin as well, but it takes a lot longer. And the only reason I put this up is because kids will say to me, yeah, but it's not as bad as LSD. It's worse than LSD. LSD will kill serotonin cells, but it takes a lot longer. Cocaine. When I was in medical school, there was a commercial on TV. This is your brain on drugs, and it was eggs in a frying pan. Everybody remember that? Well, I didn't do much for me then. So here's the real deal. This is dopamine again, left and right. We have it on both sides. You've seen this before. Here's our cocaine abuser 1 month after his last dose. Here he is 4 months later. We've now looked at him 11 years later, and he looks just like this. Cocaine kills dopamine cells. If you use enough of it and you kill enough dopamine cells, you become Parkinsonian. You get symptoms of Parkinson's disease. But before any of that happens, when you start to kill dopamine, you lose the ability to feel pleasure from anything. So what do we hear? We hear, parent will bring the kid to me and say, this is my kid, but it's not my kid. And you say, well, what does that mean? And they say, well, I don't know, things are changed. He just doesn't like doing what he used to do anymore. He doesn't hang out with his friends. I always hear, this is the classic sign, he no longer plays Xbox, or she no longer plays Xbox. What happens in the cocaine abuser is pretty dramatic. The longer they use, they start to lose brain dopamine. You can see it. You can measure it. You can measure how much. As they lose brain dopamine, they lose the ability to feel pleasure from anything. So they no longer like their friend, they don't hang out with their friend. They no longer like being in the band, they quit the band. They no longer like playing Xbox, they quit Xbox. The positive reinforcement that they tend to get at home, they don't get, so they become more combative. They become more agitated. They withdraw, but they're very quick to become agitated. So the classic sign on the cocaine abuser is a profound change in their behavior such that the things they used to like to do, they don't anymore. And that's because they've lost the chemical that allows them to feel pleasure, in this case from dopamine. Here's our normal control brain. Here's how our brain, a cocaine abuser's brain is living. In this case, this cocaine abuser has less brain activity than that 5-day-old baby had. And if you talk to cocaine abusers who've been abusing for a long period of time, they have profound cognitive loss, memory impairment, they can't do complicated tasks, they can't do simple mathematics because their brain isn't working as well as it used to. In the last 5 years, we have seen the largest increase in substance abuse with the opiates. And we kind of know why that is. Physicians have overwritten scripts for Percocet, Vicodin, Oxy. So everyone knows that what's happened is kids are getting their hands on prescription pain meds. Just to give you a sense of the size of the problem. This is 2013. In several random polls across the US asking high school seniors how many have tried an opiate for a non-medical purpose, more than half have said yes. That's more than 1 out of 2. That means every other kid in the graduating class has tried an opiate for a non-medical reason. That's how popular it's become. And we know, you all know, you're all familiar with pill parties. They're very, very common. You can't get into a party unless you bring some pills. And then everyone gets in the center of that party and puts the pills in a bowl. And then everyone has to reach in and take 2 pills. So what are they getting? They're getting the dog's heartworm medication. They're getting the ones that I hear that's really common is kids will say to me, man, I took a pill this big, size of a quarter. Well, you know what those pills are? Do you remember when you were pregnant and you had to get those vitamins? When my wife was pregnant, she had vitamins that were the size of a shoe, right? You had that she had to take. So kids are taking those, but they're also taking opiates. When my daughter came home from college several years ago, she had to have 4 wisdom teeth pulled. Now, they were all in. They didn't have to go in there with a sledgehammer. They just popped them out. Now, when I was in medical school, we took a 2-week class in pain management, where you're trained to understand how much pain is associated with a given procedure. It was a joke then. They're not doing much better today. Anyway, one of the things you learn is with a simple tooth extraction, you probably need narcotic pain management for 2 days. So she had 4 teeth pulled. She probably needed narcotics for 2 or 3 days. 3 pills a day, 9 pills. Well, she gets written for 120 80-milligram oxys. 120. And the guy says to me, because he's a friend of mine, look, if she goes through that, I'll get you some more. You get me some more. So what happens? You get the pills, 120. She takes 3. You got 117 in your house. People don't throw them away. I hear this every day. I don't throw them away. 1, I paid for them. And 2, you never know when you're going to slip on your ass, and it's good to have a Vicodin around, right? I hear it all the time. So what happens is kids get the meds, they disappear, and they end up at a pill party. Now, no one gets addicted to an opiate in the presence of pain. Let me say that again. No one gets addicted to an opiate in the presence of pain. If you go and you have an appendectomy, and your physician writes you for narcotic pain meds for the appendectomy, by all means, take it. Opiates are good medications for pain management. The problem is if he gives you 40 Vicodin, you probably only need 10. And what happens? You start taking your Vicodin to manage the pain, and by day 3, the pain is bearable, so you wouldn't need it, but you continue to take the meds anyway. And when the pain subsides and you continue to use, that's when people are getting hooked. So you don't get hooked on opiates in the presence of pain, you get hooked on opiates in the absence of pain. In my school district, I live on the East End. I can go in there any day of the week, and I can spend $25, and get one Vicodin. I can spend 20 bucks, 25 bucks, and get an oxy. Now, for the typical heroin abuser, people who have advanced in their addiction, they're taking 80 pills a day. So do the math. 25 bucks times 80 gets real expensive. So what they've done is they've switched to heroin. You can spend $4 and get 10 doses of heroin. You can spend 25 bucks and get one Vicodin, or 4 for 10 doses of heroin. Now, in the 60s, heroin wasn't very pure. So in the 60s, the heroin addict was someone with a needle in their arm. Today, heroin is over 90% pure, about 94% pure, so kids can snort it. You've seen in Newsday, it's on the cover of Newsday once a week, you can now get heroin delivered to your front door because that's how common it is and that's how cheap it is. So what does it do? Here's our normal 4 levels of the human brain. This is the top of his head, bottom of his head. Here's our heroin abuser. They become profoundly hypometabolic, just like we saw in the alcoholic. But the alcoholic, it took anywhere from 8 years to 25 years to show up. This showed up in about 8 months. So it's much faster and it's just as acute. But more troubling is this. This is a 15-year-old boy, bottom of his brain, top of his brain. Now, early on, I showed you a slide that had a couple of white spots. I said they're UBOs, and it's consistent with multiple sclerosis. And those UBOs were the size of a dime. Look how big they are here. They are enormous. In the case of opiate abuse, kids are developing what's called a white matter disease, leukoencephalopathy. It's a white matter disease that is characterized by a loss of myelin in the brain that shows up like an advanced case of MS. In the last several years, the pediatric literature has suggested that in the United States, we've seen about a 300% increase in MS. Well, we haven't seen a 300% increase in MS. We've been following for over a century, and it's not going up like that. What's happening is physicians, pediatricians aren't picking this up. Kids who are abusing opiates, in the absence of pain, are developing these leukoencephalopathies, which are kind of like MS on steroids. The thing is here, this is irreversible, and it's progressive. If they stop using, it will progress. So it's something that's really, really disturbing. You can see the white matter disease around the brain stem. You can see the white ring all around this middle piece. The brain stem is where you breathe. It's the part of your brain that allows you to breathe. It's the part of your brain that keeps you breathing at night when you don't have to think about it. But you can see what happens. The white matter around the brain stem starts to fall apart and people suffocate. So anyone who overdoses on opiates is suffocating. I'm going to end on this drug. This is methamphetamine. It's the most addictive drug we've seen. It's in every school district on Long Island. It comes in a whole bunch of colors. In its purest form, it looks like ice, hence the name crystal meth. You can make it pink, you can make it yellow, you can make it brown. You just go to CVS and get a couple things, then you go to Home Depot, you get 2 other things, and you can make it. Last fall, I was at a tailgate. I'm not a Jets fan, but my son is. I went to a Jets game. Kid came by with one of those rolling carts, coolers. Inside had 3 synthetic pots boiling, making meth, selling it at the Jets game. So it's really common. It's really common. This is my daughter when she was 12 years old. This is what a 12-year-old brain should look like. You've seen this before. Dopamine on both sides of her head. It's pretty much symmetrical. She even had some up here in her frontal cortex. This is a 12-year-old who got into methamphetamine and abused it, and she's lost more than 90% of her brain dopamine. In 6 months, she developed END, E-N-D, end-stage Parkinson's. She's blind, she's deaf, she's paralyzed, she can't go to the bathroom by herself, and she's fed on a tube. Her 6-year-old sister's in the same condition. They got into methamphetamine in their house when their parents left, and they ate it. They took it by mouth. And she developed end-stage Parkinson's. My daughter is now 27, and she's 27. She'll live the rest of her life in a vegetative state. Methamphetamine is so neurotoxic, it kills dopamine cells on contact. And when you kill enough of them, you get end-stage Parkinson's. Now, she truly is an exception. And the kids, the first thing they'll say to me is, man, that's rare. It's true, it's very rare. Len Bias was rare too. He used cocaine once and it killed him. But this is a rare case. She only took it, to the best of our knowledge, one time. And her sister, the same thing, and she developed the disease. The thing that's so scary about this is this. Every year we add 200 people to our protocols. 200 people who smoke pot, 200 people who use alcohol, 200 people who use meth. And every year we add, our NIH grants fund 200 people in each of these programs. To get into the marijuana program, like any other program, you have to say that your drug of choice is pot. You don't use coke, you don't use meth, you don't use heroin, because I can't have these confounds. In 2014, my 200 people came in for marijuana. All of them said they didn't use meth. 74% of them tested positive for meth. Now, I had 200 people. 3/4 of them tested positive for meth. All of them said they didn't use it. So some lied, but some didn't. So we had them bring their pot to us, and it had meth in it. So here's the thing. My numbers are small, 3/4 of 200. It's a small number. NIH's numbers, 8,000, 68%. Their numbers are big. So what we know is the majority of pot that's out there today has meth in it. Now, kids say to me all the time, just last night, Dr. Dewey, I picked the meth out before I smoke it. Right, okay. So they get their stuff, and they pick, it's green crystals. Dr. Dewey, have you seen it? It's big green crystals. Yeah, I understand. Big green crystals. The thing is, you can't see it. But most of the pot out there has methamphetamine in it. And if you ask kids, you can just ask them, do you shop your pot? You shop and you go get the best price? No, they go to the person who's got the best stuff. The best stuff is the stuff that's got the highest meth in it. Now, she took it PO. She took it by mouth. She ate it. If you want to get a drug into your body, the most inefficient way, you eat it. It gets digested in your mouth, your esophagus, your gut. You want to get a drug into your body the most efficient way, you smoke it. So she ate a very little amount, and this happened. Kids who were smoking blunts with meth in it are getting huge doses. So it's something to be aware of, that most of the pot, I'm right up here in Manhasset, and my sample was right around Manhasset. Most of the pot I have has meth in it. It's not even close, and you can't see it. If someone says to you that I've picked it out, I've gone through it and picked it out, they haven't. Or if they have, you're getting a really big dose, because if you can pick out crystals, you can imagine how much the small stuff is there. So the thing to be aware of is most of the pot has methamphetamine in it, and if you smoke pot with meth in it, you get doses that are much higher than the dose she got. So I'm going to end there. I really appreciate your attention.